it shouldn't be extreme to believe that we need to start again, restructure, because it's so clear that what we've got now is not working.
Welcome to the Higher Love with Megan podcast with me, your host, Megan Cooper, a holistic coach and trauma-informed practitioner. Expect conversations where we can broaden the narrative beyond the confines of privileged circles of wellness and self-development. It is my intention to take my listeners on a deep personal journey of self-discovery, to shift away from band-aid solutions, to instead address the root causes that perpetuate ongoing cycles in your life, so that you can discover your authenticity and wholeness, and truly heal and thrive. As you truly heal and thrive within yourself, you'll also be journeying together in collective discovery, understanding and uncovering the impact of how collective traumas shape our social structures and institutions and perpetuate the wider ongoing cycles of suffering. Here, diverse experiences are honoured, the status quo is challenged, and together we are fostering a space that stands for healing and thriving for all, so that we may all work, live, and parent better together. As a listener, you are not just here to passively consume. You're an ambassador for deep healing and societal evolutions, ready to engage in thought-provoking, challenging conversations. As your host, I'm committed to providing ever-expansive spaces that inspire us to contribute to a world defined by higher love. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Enjoy. Welcome back to another episode of the Higher Love with Megan podcast, with me, your host, Megan Cooper. Up on the podcast this week, we have Keri Jarvis. Keri is an intersectional feminist developmental coach, a community activist, and a charity co-founder. Her best work happens when she's exploring relational dynamics with clients, deepening their understanding of themselves and others in the context of oppressive systems, so that they can sustain easier access to their healthy adult selves and rehearse the future we're craving into being. Enjoy. Thank you so much for being here for this conversation today, Keri. It's really, really great to have you here. So thanks for sharing your wisdom and your magic with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
As an intersectional feminist coach and activist, what do you feel that this means for you today?
I suppose to say what it means to me today might be useful to just say a little bit about where I've come from with that. And the short version of that is that 11 years ago, when I had my first baby, I didn't believe that we needed feminism anymore because I earned more money than my husband. And I thought, that's it then, job done. Everything is fine because I'm fine. The confrontation that happened for me in early motherhood, the realities of the systems that we live in and the ways in which they interact with one another and impact our lives to varying extents, has kind of sent me on a learning journey over that time. And I definitely went through a few years of calling myself a feminist and, kind of really being like, oh, actually, yeah, I am. Like, I had major sudden awareness and major concerns about sex discrimination and the impact of people being marginalized by their genders. And then over time, maybe sort of since perhaps say like 2019, when things were really kicking off here around Brexit and everything that happened around that, became increasingly interested in zooming out a bit more into the wider picture of not just what is unfair on women, but other elements of injustice and marginalization in our society. So it feels really important to me to name the intersectionality of my work, which for me means, how do I include the impact that everything like white supremacy, like capitalism, and all the things that sit within that in terms of imperialism, fat phobia, all the isms and all the phobias, because when you name yourself, particularly in the online space as a feminist, and especially a feminist coach, there can be a lot of assumptions around what it is that you're here to do. Namely, largely, getting more women into positions of wealth and power, which is not what I'm about any longer.
When you say that getting women into positions of power is no longer what you're about any longer. What do you feel is what you're about in regards to that?
Well, not to be too dramatic, but the complete destruction of all of the systems that we live in. You know, what I mean by that, I know that can be overwhelming and therefore off-putting to people when we speak in these what feel like really extreme terms. But if we think about the extreme situation that we live in, where we know, for example, like the climate emergency is almost beyond recovery, we live in extremely urgent times where extreme reimagining is required. I guess what I mean to say is it shouldn't be extreme to believe that we need to start again, restructure, because it's so clear that what we've got now is not working, not just in terms of climate, but when we think about like the extent to which people are living in poverty across the world, in the UK as well, where I am, where I'm from, where I live. So all of these factors, recognizing their interconnectedness and thinking about what contributions can I make to building something different.
You mentioned around 11 years ago, you were earning more than your husband, and that was, your entry into motherhood. What is your background before going into coaching activism?
So I used to be a store manager for a major high street retailer selling sprouts and knickers. That was my thing. I loved my job so much. I loved retail. I loved the excitement of it, the challenge of like how you're going to connect with people and sort of make this sale and give great service. So I was brought up in a northern mining town in a very kind of working class community. So I had this kind of awareness around the sort of disparity between the lifestyles of and the opportunities of like the rich and the poor. But I also grew up in a generation of girls who were told like, oh, you can have it all. And if you just work hard, like you can kind of outmaneuver some of these, the idea of like social mobility and stuff, outmaneuver some of these obstacles. And then, going into that retail space and thriving in that space. Like I did do well in that space. And there was lots that I did love about it. And I met some fantastic people and built some great friendships and all of that. But I was certainly completely oblivious to most of what I would now see as like the reality of how the world is.
And, something that I just heard you say there was this narrative that we have around, you can create whatever you want, you can have whatever you want. And something that I was watching within one of your posts was talking about, and we're not kind of finger pointing on specific people, specific narratives, but this kind of the Louise Hay of, creating our thoughts, creating our reality. And that was just something that I just picked up there, of this reality of, create what we want, have what we want. And I'm just interested in your perspective here of how much that has shaped the generation that we are, and, perhaps in some respects damaged the generation that we are. I'm just interested in your perspective there, since you mentioned it.
So to your point about kind of, pointing people out, a rule that I have for myself is that I make an assessment around, am I speaking about a person or am I speaking about a brand? And my belief about Louise Hay is that I'm speaking about a brand, and she's no longer with us, of course, but essentially she represents a huge corporation, essentially, that has been able to take these ideas and make huge amounts of money out of them. And interestingly, when I was 13, my mum got breast cancer, and that was when she discovered Louise Hay. And so that was present for me at that time, that, at quite a young age, that idea. I remember like reading her books in bed at night, like when my mum had finished with You Can Heal Your Life, and really kind of feeling quite excited by that and bought into that. Gosh, it was a similar feeling to, I think many women, girls of a similar kind of age bracket to us used to watch Matilda and imagine that we could become Matilda and move objects with our minds. It was like a similar kind of feeling, but it was like an adult saying that you can, a similar kind of like, there was something so fantastical about it, and it felt exciting. So I think that someone who offers really interesting perspectives on this is a writer who is not with us anymore, called Barbara Ehrenreich. And she has this book called Smile or Die: How Positive Thinking Fooled America and the World. And it's really an exploration of like going back even further than people like Louise Hay. Like, how did some of these ideas emerge in early America, in the lives of people who were living with Calvinism, this like really kind of quite extreme form of Protestant religion where suffering was a virtue, and how was this like a kind of backlash against that sort of horrible, really like traumatic lifestyle that people were leading. So she kind of follows the path of it through to like the kinds of things that we see today about manifestation and quantum leaping and, all of this. She kind of joins all of these dots in a way that I find really interesting. But I think that on a practical level, as women in our generation, yes, I do think that we've been harmed by the kind of mainstreaming of that narrative that you can have it all, do it all, be it all. Because it's just completely stripped of any context. I feel like no one was telling my husband or my brother in the same generation, like, oh, you're going to have to pick up a bit more of the slack for like your wives and sisters to be able to have these lives, when we think in terms of the division of labour in the home and the mental load and other caring responsibilities as well. We know that like for the elderly as well, women are much more likely to be doing the care. So there's all of that. There's the fact that it doesn't acknowledge systemic factors that I might do okay as a white woman who grew up working class, but then was like the first person in my family to go to university, and I'm straight and I'm slim and I'm clever in a way that society values, and maybe I will be able to sort of climb through the system quite significantly. But there was I certainly had no concept at that time of the different ways in which systems impact our lives and how I might actually have advantages.
Yeah, absolutely. I find it so interesting looking at, what is such a widespread school of thought of, we can create what we want, have what we want, our thoughts, create, shape our reality. And so much of that sounds and feels empowering. But also the importance of recognizing the flip side of that, which, is obviously what we're speaking to here. How do you see that type of framework playing out within the wellness industry and a lot of the narratives that we see online today within the wellness industry that are harmful in that kind of way?
I think there are varying degrees of it. I think there are ways in which people who have multiple intersecting marginalized identities repeatedly told online that all of their problems are of their own making, that they need to just kind of see things differently, that it's about the vibration, the frequency that they are vibrating at is attracting all of their problems. We see it in so much of the oversimplification that occurs, I think. And what's really maddening, I think, is that there are many things that have some nugget of helpfulness in them that then just become so vastly oversimplified that not only are they stripped away of their helpfulness really, but they also become like extremely harmful to some groups. So if you think about something that you see all the time, and I used to say this as well, like there's lots of things that I used to say that I wouldn't say anymore. Like this idea that like we teach people how to treat us, for example. So like within that is this nugget of sort of acknowledgement that if we continue to accept certain behaviours from people, they're more likely to repeat them. If we are able to articulate and hold our boundaries more firmly, they're more likely to be respected. Like, that's all fine. But what that doesn't account for is, people of colour don't teach white people to be racist to them. Like that, or, women in domestic abuse scenarios don't teach their partners to be abusive towards them. Yeah. And I think as an industry, including myself, coaching, wellness, I think we've just become so careless in this really ironic way in our pursuit of status for ourselves as individuals. I'll just say the most provocative thing, I'll say the most simple thing, I'll kind of try to have this like mic drop moment or this hot take that will get me followers or elevate me in people's minds. At what cost? Like at a significant cost to people who are navigating real world problems.
a word that I know comes up a lot for you within your work is relational approach, and talking about, the way that we interconnect and we interrelate. Can you speak to that in terms of the importance of having this interrelated approach instead of this individualized approach within wellness?
So someone whose work I'm really enjoying at the moment is Donna J. Haraway, and her book, Staying with the Trouble, which is a very intense book. And if anyone is kind of interested in these themes, but maybe intimidated by the book, as I am, what I'm also doing is listening to this podcast called the Book on Fire podcast, where they take a chapter each week and they read it and like explain it to you. So hot tip about that. But she has this piece about composting, which I found so inspiring. So the quote is something like, we require each other in unexpected combinations, in hot compost piles. We become with one another or not at all. And I find that such a capture of the nature of our reality as relational beings, in that you and I, for example, will come to the end of this conversation changed. We've arrived at the conversation interested in, willing to engage. And I will be changed by things that you say, and you will be changed by things that I say. And this happens in every conversation that we have. Yeah. And I think a lot of the suffering or discomfort that we endure emerges from our determination to be unchanged in relation, to be invulnerable, to want to cling to sort of certainties that we are already rooted in, because in our society like that, it's kind of a form of collateral to be certain, especially, again, like if you're running a business and you've got a brand, like there's all of this encouragement to, be bold and be sure and position yourself with this, I'm an expert here and I sort of know everything. Essentially, my work is about acknowledging or supporting people to deepen into this awareness that they already have, that they can't do much alone, as that we're never really doing anything alone, that we're not self-made and cannot be. We're made of other human beings, but also we're made of, what we eat and the air that we breathe and the water we drink, and how that connects us beyond even people that we immediately have contact with. What do my decisions about my spending habits, for example, what impact do they have on people working in a sweatshop on the other side of the world, or people in a place where excess clothing is being dumped? Or, so really trying to root my clients and myself in this reality that nothing that's happening to us is happening in isolation. Yeah. And using that to access self-compassion around, gosh, life is really complex actually, and it's really tricky to navigate that. And to remember as well that we bring so much of our relation with us, that we're not able to sort of fragment and isolate these parts of ourselves and just sort of, I'll show up here just as we hear a lot, don't we, about like the best version of ourselves, or like our highest self, or and again, I think in the industry that can just create so much shame around what's wrong with my whole self, and the more that we sort of seek to suppress these parts. I think I've seen you talking about this as well, these kind of parts that we are taught to conceal. The louder they scream for our attention, and the more difficult it becomes for us to relate in healthy ways. So I'm not sure that I've said anything that's succinct there, but hopefully there's a little tour of what goes on in my head when I think about relation.
It was an excellent tour. Thank you. There was so much in there. And yeah, it's so interesting, this concept of coming away from the individual. And, of course, we all have our own individual experiences, our own unique experiences on the planet, but they're all, as you said, interrelated. And I was listening to a podcast a long time ago with Gabor Mate, who's obviously probably my most commonly used word in my vocabulary, just due to my training. But it really struck me that he was talking about, even within mental health, the way that it's treated. When you're working with a therapist, it's very much, okay, you're experiencing depression, anxiety, whatever it is, fill in the blank, because of what happened to you in your childhood and your unique experiences and various things. But he was like, actually, let's zero out here, because the whole world is struggling with or the whole huge amount of society is struggling with mental health. So yes, it's about individual experiences, but it's also about the society and the environment in which we're living. Otherwise, not everyone would be experiencing so many challenges. So even on just that perspective of kind of zeroing out and witnessing, wow, so much of this is systemic, institutionalized challenges. And that's, without even going into, marginalized groups, various different things within society, but just these huge factors that affect us on such a massive kind of micro and macro level.
And I discovered someone called Nora Bateman just over the last couple of days. I saw someone speaking about her on LinkedIn, and I'm waiting for the book to arrive, so I'm listening to the podcast. And she was talking about similar theme, how we sort of, when we look at a problem in isolation, she was talking about using pesticides in order to increase the food crop for a growing population, and how it solves the problem in terms of you stop having these food shortages because you've got enough food now for people, but the pesticides ruin the soil and ruin the river and all the other impacts of that on people's health and drinkable water and whatnot. And yeah, I feel like this is a lot of what we try to do. We seek to isolate all the time, like the individual, and also just the tiny part of the individual's context as well. And we really struggle to acknowledge, again, like wholeness, and or to sort of allow someone to be an integrated being. When you were speaking about mental health, what was coming up for me was this sense that our systems as they are really reaching their limits in terms of being able to maintain that pretense around how the world works. I was saying at the start, like, oh, tear it down, let's start again. But I think that mental health example, when you said, like, I don't know what proportion of people are suffering with mental health problems. And I would actually say, like, there's some stuff around the pathologizing of mental health that I would like take issue with. And I would say probably the vast majority of us are mentally unwell to some extent, and obviously not as acutely unwell as others. But it just goes to show, doesn't it, how what we're doing is not working. And yet there is still this sense that to imagine it could be different is crazy, is just wild.
And a question was just coming up for me. We talked about the individualization. We talked about the oversimplification of quite complex ideas. And, those obviously presenting challenges within the wellness space and the narratives that are present. What do you feel as coaches, facilitators, people who cultivate these spaces and, also put narratives into the public arena? What do you feel are perhaps the most proactive things that we can do to counteract the narrative that has been going on?
It's an interesting question. I think that there are things that we can do that are strategic, and there are things that we can do that are about self-interrogation, that are more kind of long-term and developmental, because issues are urgent. And therefore, I do think that as soon as we have some awareness that we are harming people or excluding people, that we have some responsibility to take some action. So I can speak to some kind of strategic things. And I also think in the long term, the most important thing that we can do is commit to unlearning. So unlearning all of what we've been told through the systems that we live in, of patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, and everything that sits with it, about how the world works. And there are obviously so many fantastic teachers out there who are leading that kind of decolonization of our minds. Someone that I absolutely love to learn from in the business space is Troy Smith. But when someone's like, everything they post, you're like, yes, like if I could like this 500 times, I would. And I also did some anti-racist allyship training with someone called Nova Reed, who I hugely recommend people check out her work. She has a book, The Good Ally. In terms of these kind of strategic things that we can do, I think we need to get really honest with ourselves about who is included in our spaces. And I have this mischief in me. So I have this part of me that's like this, developed, hugely sort of understanding and compassionate around this my core belief is that all of our behaviors emerge from our experiences and that our behaviors are completely understandable. And that's what I take into my coaching. And that's how I offer people unconditional positive regard, however they're showing up. However, I definitely have this mischief in me where I want to rewrite the bios of some of us in the wellness space, where we're saying things like, here to help women XYZ, and I want to rewrite it to here to help women with $10,000 a year disposable income to XYZ, because let's be honest, we're not including, this isn't for everyone. This is for people with a certain socioeconomic status. And a few years ago, it felt like there was a lot of pushback around that. When the challenge kind of first started to come in, I think around the time when everything was getting really huge around Black Lives Matter and people's engagement with that, that was a time when a bit of consciousness rising around capitalism started to kick in a bit more. And there was quite a bit of pushback in some spaces that I'm in about how people are being excluded economically. And it was often really met with this, oh no, you're being misogynistic, because you only feel cross with me because I'm a woman, and you don't think women should be able to charge this much, and you're not attacking men in the same way, which there's something to that for sure. And also, first of all, I don't think people were being attacked. We could have a whole conversation about particularly white women and our sense that we're being attacked when we're just being sort of offered a piece of feedback about behaviours. But if we were, what people like me were doing was looking at people we already shared space with, looking at people we were already in relationships with, and saying have you thought about how, you're not really making space for these people? And have you thought about how you are explicitly saying that you are here, that kind of language that we see around mission and God-given purpose and divinely assigned, this, that, and the other, which have no issue with that in general, but I can't understand how there could be a divinely assigned purpose to support people from a particular socio-economic group. That's where I get what?
Totally. And it's really interesting. I feel around mission, purpose, legacy, the way that is talked about. And I'm still kind of reconciling this in my head, because ultimately I think that a lot of the ways that as white, middle class, privileged people, comparatively to a huge proportion of the world, having a mission in some kind of way, or having a legacy, or having a purpose, which this kind of grand purpose in terms of what I'm here to do and what I'm here to bring to the world, that in itself seems privileged. Because a huge proportion of the world are here to put food on the table for their families and support their families and exist within their community and work and live and have, that dynamic within their life. And that is, of course, purpose, because providing for your family and your community is purpose. But I find some of the narrative around that within the wellness industry of, discover your purpose and your mission, and in a way that is in itself privileged, would you say?
Absolutely. And I would say, to go beyond what you were discussing around, some people, the kind of the purpose they get to have is providing for their families and whatnot. For others, the purpose they get to have is surviving the impact of climate change in areas of the world where it's caused by the West, or trying to keep their children alive through conflict. There are so many versions of people's lives that we are so detached from or ignorant about. And it's that sort of ignorance and that delusion of separateness that really allows us then to have these grand ideas about our own purpose and our own mission. And I used to be very into legacy as a kind of motivator a few years ago, and I was in my kind of girl boss era, very into it, really sort of, motivated by it. And I don't know, I felt like a sense of, something bigger than me and something to leave behind. And that sense of bigger, more, what can I be? How can I outlive myself? There's something quite egocentric about legacy as well. And now I think about, what contribution do I make to my lineage? How do I how am I being like within a collective? And also, how do I feel about that being fairly anonymous? I've really made my peace with the fact that nobody's going to remember my name in 150 years, say. God, if there's even anyone left on the planet at that point. But no one's probably going to remember my name. But if I think about, I lost my granddad a few years ago, who I was really close to. And I think about him and his impact on my life and his impact on so many other people's lives. He was a very ordinary man with a very ordinary life. And it really shifted my perspective on what we leave behind and the kind of worth of our lives, because what felt so precious was people speaking about these very ordinary experiences of healthy relation that they'd had with him, like this generosity that he'd shared and the kind of the calmness that he brought to scenarios where people were sort of getting themselves, where confrontation was happening and whatnot, and just the love that people had for him. And I thought, oh God, like that's enough, right? Like, what does it matter that in another 100 years no one will know his name? Like, what did he put in? What did he invest into this world? And I think we're so, quite understandably, we're so connected to the idea that there needs to be a payoff. There needs to be like, what can I get back? What do I get out of what I do, whether it's status or money or something similar? And actually we need to be moving more towards like, well, what do we need? What do we need as a collective? And recognizing that if we're not investing in that collective, that's not like a just we're not doing it. It's like it is an action in itself. It's not just a lack of action. It's a decision, essentially, like not to be invested in the collective.
Yeah. I love what you were just saying there. And it really brought up this thought for me that I had about 6 months ago, which was thinking about, in order for me to be here today, living the life that I have, that's dated back since the origins of humanity. Like how many generations have there been of my ancestors? The vast majority of which would have just been alive to, live, procreate, put food on the table for their families, die. I don't know any of their names. There were people 500 years ago that were just living their lives completely unaware that me, their future ancestor, would be here today. And that works both ways. So, again, I reiterate your thought of, well, how long is humanity going to last here? But if we just put that to the side, how many people, would live from me not knowing my name, and here I am with considering mission, purpose, and, all of the things that I'm supposed to be doing. But actually, when we can release ourselves from that and understand that people will be alive in hundreds of years, say thousands of years, who didn't even know about my existence, I feel like there is something very relieving and humbling about that. But then there is something that happens for me quite organically, which is, well, I just, within the kind of realm of control that I have in this, very large planet and society, want to be able to do the best that I can for the society that we have at this time. And what does that actually look like? In what way can I control that? And, I guess then it comes back to all of the things that you've just been saying around this kind of radical education. How can I be more inclusive? Radical kind of unlearning. And I think that there is a certain attitude that is necessary for that. As in, I remember when I was trying to educate myself quite a lot around, Black Lives Matter and, reading around a lot about race. And my first reaction was, I've done something wrong because, of perhaps the way that I've been. And that was a little bit of a process to be able to get beyond that, to then get myself into a mindset of, okay, well, I'm currently not doing some stuff, but what can I do now? So what do you feel like, I don't want to say the right attitude is as a space holder or facilitator, but for want of a better word, what is a proactive kind of attitude that we can bring into this unlearning or relearning?
So what's coming up for me as you're talking is something that happens for a lot of my clients and for myself all the time, is that so lots of us have grown up as girls who were good girls. We were ticking these good girl boxes. We were achieving well and doing what was expected of us. And we recognize through our childhoods that forms of good behavior and good results and like good achievement, that they give us a kind of form of collateral with which we then move through the world. Like, if I behave in these ways that people expect of me, then I will be accepted. I will belong here. I will receive love. And, then I'll get opportunities and whatnot, and people will like me, and then my life will be easier. And all of these things that create for us a sense of kind of psychological safety. And so when we are confronted by something that threatens some facet of our identity, I am clever, or I am well informed, or I am kind of worldly, or I am decent and good. Any of those things can be threatened by realizing, like, gosh, I've been doing something that is like perpetuating harm in some way. And really the practice is around getting to grips with, again, to come back to this idea of wholeness. Yes, I value sort of being well informed, and I value being sort of good and decent, and I seek to embody those traits and characteristics. But no person can be these, particular things all of the time. And really being able to separate out like who I am from these specific examples of our behaviors. Because if we can be like, gosh, I am in a relationship with myself where my sense of self is sort of continuously created, like I can see myself as fluid, which is a kind of developmental approach. Like the self is fluid. We're becoming all the time. We're becoming in relation with one another. Then it's a lot easier for us to be able to kind of separate out. So there's someone whose work I really enjoy called Robert Keegan, and he talks about in the stages of adult development, this kind of shift from this subject-object shift, he calls it, where we move from like, I am this way, to these are behaviors that I try to embody or seek to embody or whatever. And when we're in that place, we can say, I am still my whole self over here, like all the parts that I'm proud of and all the parts that I'm really not proud of. And right in front of me here, almost like I can hold them in my hands and look at them, are my behaviors. And I can interrogate these behaviors and say, well, this is really not great. Like I'm not proud of this. I'm not proud of how I've behaved. I can make sense of it. So I'm not talking about excuses, but I am talking about sort of reasons and making sense of how we came to have particular points of view. And when we can make sense of how we arrived at one point of view, that can also free us up to arrive at a different point of view, and we acknowledge how our behaviors do emerge from our experiences. So, really being willing to reject what is demanded of us in the online space, which is like when you're the guru, when you're the leader, when you're the space holder, when you're like the coach at the top of the pyramid, like, when you're seeking to occupy all of these spaces, you're the teacher, that there ought to be this presentation of perfection. Like, if we can just release this and claim like, gosh, I've made some mistakes, or I'm doing things differently now. I think when I was first sort of changing my approach, language like, oh, there are things that I used to do that I wouldn't do anymore, was just really useful for me, because it's quite neutral, like it's not judgmental, but it is like making a statement, that like things are changing here. So I don't know if there's something useful in all of that.
So many useful things. I want to talk a little bit about how you create inclusivity within your work. And there were some quotes within your post that I was reading earlier that I'd really like to just bring into the conversation. So some of the things that I really related to and loved, you said, I want to weep at the absence of imagination in the spiritual coaching and wellness industries. We could all be so much more than millionaires. Alongside middle-class women going from 6 to 7-figure businesses is not the revolution. We need class consciousness, an absolute overhaul of the system. And just one more. These are all brilliant. Imagine if we could redirect all the ambition from building 7, 8, 9-figure businesses towards dignified lives for all and maintaining a livable planet. I loved all of these, and they're all kind of more or less speaking to the same thing, but I would love for you just to speak to that and what you're trying to bring attention to within the industry by these comments.
So in my work outside of my coaching business, I am the co-founder of a charity where we seek to alleviate the impacts of hygiene poverty in our community in Southend, where I live in Essex. And having this duality in my life, having sort of one foot in one space, real life on the ground, on your doorstep, where people are willing to queue for 2 hours in the rain for a packet of nappies or a bottle of shampoo or something like that for their children. And then having another foot in the Instagram world of, abundance, let's say, and some of the fantasies around it. It has been quite the journey. It has been a mind-boggling experience at times. And so I spent a lot of time refining the ways in which I want to speak to my experience of occupying both of those spaces. And when I first started to do that, I didn't do that well. I was very much in a space of like accusation and judgment and shame. And, just wanting to tell people like who they were, wanting to tell people like, you are a fraud, you are a liar, you are ridiculous, really so mad, so much rage, and really just wanting to give that to people and be like, you take that and you sit with it, and then I'll go back to being morally superior to you all. Like, moral superiority is so within reach for me. I have to really watch it still now. But over time, what I've tried to come to is offering up stories that people can tolerate, maybe, for want of a better word, sort of inviting reflection around these matters, rather than telling people what I think of their behaviours. Now, I have a number of clients who regularly attend group work with me who are extremely poor, and it's difficult to capture the magnitude of the contribution that they make to the kind of group work that I do, because of the perspective that they bring that otherwise would be missing from the group. And it's of such service to everyone else in the group to have those people there as well. So when I'm talking about giving spaces away or offering pay what you can afford in group spaces, people will often assume that I'm doing this out of a sort of benevolence or something. I don't consider it to be like charitable. Even in sort of the charity that we run, that we've had to register as a charity because otherwise we couldn't get enough money to keep it going. The slogan has always been solidarity, not charity. And I feel the same in my work. I don't think that people should be grateful to me for having like a pay what you can afford space. I think it's like the bare minimum that people could expect from me. I notice that being in this kind of meaningful community with people who are in very different economic circumstances than you are, it's an accelerator for our own unlearning. And I'm conscious as I say this, I don't mean to be like, oh, my clients who are poor coming into my groups and teaching people what it's like to be poor. Like, I don't mean it to kind of land in that way, and that's certainly not the experience that people are having. No one knows who is paying what in the spaces. There is certainly like equity and equality in terms of how people show up. But some people will choose to claim for themselves. They will choose to share in the space, like, this is my situation and this is how it relates to the issue that we're discussing here. And I can't imagine going back to the way that I used to work, which was that people were only in spaces that I was running, when they could afford to be, which sometimes would be like, I don't know, like a workshop that was like 50 quid or whatever, or maybe like a longer term thing that was hundreds of pounds. And it feels you know, when you've been through some kind of deepening in your understanding and something feels so clear to you that it's hard to connect back to how you saw it before, that like Copernican shift that happens. But to me, working class and poor people are like the last group that we're excluding. Like we're all kind of being like, oh, I'm doing my anti-racist work and I'm interrogating my, heteronormativity biases or like cis heteronormativity biases. But we're not really talking about how we're not including poor people in our spaces. And I imagine that as people are listening to this, we can even get this like physiological response to talking about poor people. And like we don't want to admit it. We don't want to admit that we're in proximity to that. We want to kind of imagine that people who are poor are different from us, because then that makes it okay that we don't include them in the kinds of things that we're talking about. And obviously that's just not true.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is challenging that coaching, therapy, the type of work that you and I do in the spaces that we probably, see a lot and participate within, it's challenging that is, generally speaking, only available to people who have the cash to pay for it. And I think that there's a lot of challenging narratives also within, the coaching industry that I hear, which is, somebody's financial investment is equal to their energetic investment that they're putting in. And, the more that I thought about that, I was like, well, how does that work? Because someone might be really hungry to create change in their life, but don't have 10 grand, 20 grand, 50, 50 quid, I mean, and I say 10 grand because I know that the coaching industry fees can be enormous, but, a lot of people don't have access to that kind of money, but it's not in any way, shape or form a reflection on how much they do want to create some kind of shift within their life.
And actually, people who have been impoverished are amongst the most resourceful, motivated, clever, creative people, because they have to be. And for lots of people have always had to be. And I think that, that kind of, I used to have a coach who used to say the transformation is in the transaction. And I used to believe it, and I used to repeat it to other people as well. And this is stuff I think is really important. Like for anyone listening who's like, I might like to make some changes around this. Like, let's just hold our hands up and be like, God, I used to say shit like that. Like, let's just like be in it together. But what was coming up for me when you were talking is, so I don't know, 50 quid to me might be some kind of, I might have some kind of like energetic, I don't know, like amount attached to it, like what I need to get back to make 50 quid worth spending. Whereas 50 quid to somebody else might be all their disposable income that month, or it might be like absolutely nothing to them. Like they could drop a £50 note and not even bother picking it up. So we really miss that context when we're talking about sums. There needing to be certain sums of money that evoke this kind of like transformational motivation. And when I'm offering people pay what you can, so on all of my workshops and group work, all of my workshops, I have unlimited pay what you can spaces, and all of my group work, I have a designated number of pay what you can spaces if I'm containing the size of the group. And what I will say to people in the kind of like the sales page, the info page, whatever about that, is capitalism encourages us to extract as much as we can from one another. I want to be fair to you, and I trust you to be fair to me. Maybe you're doing a lot of unpaid care work. Maybe you're doing lowly paid work that society doesn't value. Or maybe you have health issues, care and responsibilities, or some other issue that is preventing you from being able to afford this product. Like nobody has to tell me, why they can't afford it, because I think that's another thing that I see happening. People will say like, apply for this space, which I'm not like here to like, I'm not saying that that's not better than not having any option for people. But I also think there's something potentially like, undignified about needing to tell someone why you can't afford something. And then potentially the prices of those things are sometimes still quite high anyway. And it's like, now they maybe feel an obligation to invest because they've been through this application process. So I think we've got to think all the time about the power dynamics involved and how we can just make everything as equitable as possible.
I love that. And would you say that the way in which you work now, of having, you know, options, pay as you feel, do you say that you find more fulfillment within your work now than you used to in, say, I love what you described as your girl boss era?
Yeah, so I think at the time, you know, for a little bit more context, not to tell my life story, but I had years of like postnatal depression and just so much confusion, just in such a kind of state of flux and discombobulation about coming into this sort of essentially like a kind of feminist awakening, or the beginning of one, and feeling so disconnected from my own identity and from all those forms of collateral that I'd had before. Like it all just seemed to have sort of fallen away because I was tired all the time, I was a mess, and you know, all of that stuff. And I noticed that lots of women who occupy that space are in a similar stage of life where they've got quite young children. And I don't think that's coincidence. I know that's not everyone in that space, but I don't think it's coincidence, because I think that we're like, oh my God, I've landed here. Life is not what I thought it was. Childcare is extortionately expensive. I kind of want to be with my baby more. Like, how am I going to? So we're sort of vulnerable to these ideas that there are these really simple ways that we can earn loads of money and do what we love. And so there was lots about that time that I enjoyed at the time. And I'm not saying that I didn't do meaningful work at that time. I believe that, and based on things that people tell me, I believe that some meaningful work was going on that was within my capacity at that time and was what was the right fit for those clients at that time. Looking back at it now, it feels, I don't know, I guess it's just like, you know, any of us, children and adults, you look back at the work that you've done when you were younger and you're like, oh, it seems so basic. Like it seems so surface level. It seems so basic. But I say that with self-compassion. It was what I understood at the time. And now I feel a genuine sense of like integrity in my work, I suppose, where I feel that I'm taking practical steps in my community to improve people's experiences of this life in the city that I live in. I do that in relationship with some brilliant humans who I just absolutely love, and having them in my life makes all the difference. So doing that together is awesome, because another thing that, you know, is difficult, as you know, about this life that we live, is like doing everything on your own. And so there's that. And it feels like my work is making a genuine contribution to helping people to access perspectives that could make some small contributions to an improving world. Maybe in 5 or 10 years, I'll be like, what was I on about in 2024? Now, whatever, I don't know. I don't know how much further to the left I could go, to be honest, but we'll see.
Well, I don't know. We've got a few systems to dismantle first, don't we?
Yeah.
What would you love to see within the wellness space and wider society in general?
I would love to see a refusal of the seduction of simplicity in the wellness space. I would love to see an acknowledgement of context and complexity, and in terms of sort of big picture and the way that individual people move through the world. I would love for us as an industry to reject, to the greatest possible extent, the compulsion to brand ourselves and niche ourselves, and to kind of to try to strip ourselves back to some sort of like succinct, I don't know, 3 sound bites that are like, this is who I am now, like, and this is what I stand for. I would love all of us to have access to more wholeness. And I suppose that speaks to, you know, what I feel about the world more broadly as well. Because one of my favourite people to follow, their name is Ray Yassai, and they're a British Iranian activist and climate. They work for Parents for Future, and they do all this beautiful poetry. And it's just this one simple line from their poetry just stays with me. Like, we could be so beautiful. We could be so beautiful. And, you know, in some of their poems, it's like, we can be so ugly. This is true also. But I really recommend looking up their poetry. It's this beautiful blend of, gosh, I'm so soothed by these words, and also I'm deeply confronted by everything that's contained in them. So yeah, does that answer your question?
It does. Absolutely. Absolutely. How can people connect with you, and what do you have going on in your world right now that people might be interested in knowing about?
Thank you. So I have just landed in the Portal, which is a new online learning platform that my lovely friend Sally is the creator of. And it's essentially like intended to be an alternative to the ways in which online learning platforms and social media sort of pedestalize or make hierarchies of the ways in which we learn. And instead, her system is based on permaculture principles and the kind of mycelium network vibe. So it's very new. It's in the kind of early stages of that ecosystem. So I've just landed on there where I'm running a kind of experimental, I don't know, we're not calling it a membership because neither of us are vibing with that, but that's the kind of thing that's going on in there. It's called composting. And other than that, at the moment, all I have open are some kind of one-off one-to-ones, all of the links and everything in my Instagram bio. I'm really reassessing my relationship with Instagram at the moment. I'm trying to establish myself on LinkedIn of all places, which I'm weirdly enjoying. I found some interesting stuff there, which has been surprising. So yeah, you know, all those places I can be found hanging out online basically all the time.
I feel like me and Instagram are constantly re-navigating our relationship. We're a little bit on and off and in and out.
Yeah, get that.
Keri, was there anything else that you wanted to share with us or listeners today?
No, just thank you so much for having me. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you for listening. It's great to have you with me on this journey towards higher love for all. Our time is our greatest commodity and gift, so thanks for investing it in yourself and sharing it with me. Please do take a moment to rate and review the show, all of which enables more people to find me and for me to connect with more great guests each week for both yours and my enjoyment. All links, references and contact information is detailed too within the show notes. And I always love to hear your feedback, so feel free to hit me up on my Instagram at higherlove_with_Megan or via my website higher-love.com. Send your takeaways, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share or send on to someone else who would benefit. Until next time, big love.